Okay, this is going to be a very brief screencast, about 3 or 4 slides worth, but it's going to cover some things that were not covered in the Heart Basics screencast. The material is coming from the first chapter of your book, really the first page or so, and so you can follow along there if you'd like. Okay, just before we actually get to basic electrophysiology, which is what the presentation is about, I want to talk about a couple of things, and that is the comparison between electrical activity of the heart and mechanical activity of the heart. And they're really very simple. Electrical activity is exactly as it implies. That has to do with the impulse that's propagated that we talked about in the Heart Basics presentation, that's initiated at the SA node and then is propagated or carried out all the way through all of the cardiac tissue and causes the heart to pump blood 72 times a minute, 60 minutes an hour, 24 hours a day. So this electrical activity is separate from the mechanical activity. The mechanical activity actually is what we're talking about when we look at the movement of the heart, primarily the heart walls. If any of you have ever had a sonogram of your heart done or maybe seen that done, that's what they're looking at. They look at wall motion, and that's a mechanical process. These two are very related. The electrical impulse causes the mechanical movement, but you could have an electrical impulse perhaps without mechanical movement. You're really not going to have much mechanical movement without electrical impulse, but they are two separate things yet very closely tied together. This class is primarily going to look at the electrical impulse. Now we can know that in a healthy human heart, when certain aspects of the electrical impulse occur, certain mechanical properties of mechanical things occur. So they are linked, but at the same time separate. The electrical activity, how does that all occur? Well, as we talked about in the last in the Heart Basics screencast, cardiac tissue has this capability, and I'll start down here, of automaticity, which means the cardiac tissue can discharge on its own. It actually has the capability to fire without an external impulse. It's not to say that can never happen in skeletal muscle, but certainly skeletal muscle is typically discharged when a neural impulse reaches it through the nervous system. You've run across this. If y'all had, it's just basic physiology. You probably ran across in high school. What happens is that the cardiac cells or stay in what is, as we talked about before, a polarized state. We talked about in the previous indication that once, or previous presentation, that once the discharge is initiated, polarization occurs, and that polarization again is nothing more than sodium that is typically in high concentration outside of the cell. When it rushes inside the cell, potassium comes out. That changes the electrical charge of the cell. And what this does, as it does with nervous tissue, nervous cells, same situation. This propagates throughout the heart muscle. It propagates. Remember, because of the nature of cardiac tissue, very synchronously, and all. And so the cardiac heart muscle actually just contracts all at one time, which is very convenient. As we see here, sodium does have a stronger concentration on the outside of the cell, making it more positively typically. And when all that happens is once that the impulse is initiated, then whether it's on its own or from some electrical activity outside, sodium rushes into the cell. Then we see, although it's not discussed here, it's discussed in your book, this sodium-potassium pump, which you've probably run across, basically returns the sodium-potassium to its original position, and it's ready for another impulse. Really, the last thing I want to talk about is, and this is in your book, you can see a very similar, although it's in your first chapter because I'm looking at the older copy of the text, and I have written for my own. This is at the end of the first chapter. On my book is page 10. It may be a little different around yours. But I want to talk a little bit about autonomic control of heart rate. In other words, we said that certainly the SA node that's represented here can fire on its own. and it does fire on its own. You know, that's really it. There's no external. It has intrinsic capability to fire on its own, but it can be affected. The heart rate, of course, can go up and it can go down. Y'all are very aware of that, and that is controlled by our autonomic nervous system. If y'all can recall, you probably recall from basic anatomy and physiology, the autonomic nervous system is broken down into two parts: the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. The fight or flight, the sympathetic system is more of a that occurs when in stressful situation. Parasympathetic more in relaxed situation dominates. But what happened is that the sympathetic nervous system works. I have another picture I'm going to show you. This a little bit better than this one. Via or by way of a cardio accelerator nerve. And I'm going to show you a little better picture of that in a minute. Action on the heart causes increases in both heart rate, AV conduction, or in other words, the conduction across the from the atria to the ventricles, and then irritability. And we're going to talk about that word, what that means. Irritability. If there are some irritable spots on the heart, meaning these locations that can fire on their own, it will increase that firing, and we'll talk about that. Parasympathetic nervous system is just the opposite. It affects via primarily affects, by the way, primarily the parasympathetic system really only affects the atria, whereas the sympathetic nervous system, by way of the cardiac accelerator nerve, affects both the atria and the ventricles. But the parasympathetic nervous, by way of the vagus nerve, decreases all these things, decreases heart rate, decreases the conduction between the atria and the ventricles, and decreases irritability. So, take-home message: the sympathetic nervous system, by way of the cardiac accelerator nerve, increases heart rate, AV conduction, irritability. This is the dominant system during exercise. Sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that's part of the reason, along with a lot of other things, that our heart rate goes up. Parasympathetic nervous system, by way of the vagus nerve, decreases all these things. The parasympathetic nervous system predominates once we become trained, and this is one of the reasons that a trained athlete's heart rate is slower than an untrained individual, because there's a shift in dominance at rest toward the parasympathetic nervous system. One other drawing, let me see if we can get in here real quickly. It's posted in your, you'll see, I'm not going to take the time to go back into Blackboard, but you'll see a very similar drawing like this. It's called under autonomic control, and it just gives you another diagram of the same thing. It shows you the same thing, a little more specifics, but all basically the same thing. That concludes this screencast. I'll post this, hoping once you all to have looked at these, where we can move forward in class on Monday. By the way, class will be this Monday, and we'll see you then.